the unexpected guests before we dive into Sarah's story. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had a house guest who completely changed the way you see your own life? Someone who walked into your perfectly ordered world and made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? Well, that's exactly what happened to Sarah. And trust me, you won't see this coming. The phone call seemed normal enough when it came through. Just another Tuesday evening dinner, dishes still sitting in the sink, and me curled up on the couch with my book. The caller ID showed Mark's name, my husband calling from his car on the way home from another long day at the office. "Hey, honey." His voice came through the speaker, carrying that familiar mix of tiredness and the slight distraction he always had when he was driving through rush hour traffic. I could almost picture him sitting there, one hand on the wheel, the other holding. His phone probably stuck at the same red light he hit every single day. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, marking my place in the book. "How was your day?" "Oh, the usual chaos," he said, and I heard the sound of his turn signal clicking. "But listen, I've got some news. Dave called me at work today." "Dave? David?" "My brother-in-law. Mark's younger brother by about 5 years, and honestly, someone I'd never quite figured out how to read. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, not exactly. He was just ... distant. Like he was always thinking about something else, somewhere else. Always seemed like he was living in a completely different world from our quiet, predictable life here in Oakwood Creek, while Mark and I had spent the last 20 years building our steady, comfortable existence, raising our 2 kids who are now grown up and living their own lives, settling into our routines, finding our rhythm as a middle-aged couple. David had been the complete opposite. He was the adventurous one, the wanderer, always jumping from one city to another, one job to the next, sometimes even bouncing between different countries. Like he was collecting passport stamps, his visits to our house were pretty rare, usually just quick stops during Christmas or Thanksgiving, filled with polite small talk that never seemed to go deeper than asking about the weather or commenting on how much the kids had grown. Pleasant enough conversations, but they always felt like we were skating on the surface of something much deeper. "Oh," I said, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I actually felt. "That's nice. How's he doing?" He's good, Mark said, and I could hear the genuine happiness in his voice. Mark absolutely adored his little brother, always had. Sometimes I thought he still saw David through the eyes of a protective older brother, remembering the kid who used to follow him around rather than seeing the somewhat mysterious man he'd become. "Actually," Mark continued, "that's why I'm calling. He's coming into town next week. Needs a place to stay for a few days while he sorts out some kind of business deal." I told him, of course, he could crash with us. I felt my stomach do a little flip, though I couldn't quite say why. "Oh, okay. For how long?" "Just 3 nights, maybe 4 at the most," Mark said quickly, probably hearing the hesitation in my voice. "It'll be great, Sarah. We haven't had a real chance to catch up with him in ages. You know how it is with his schedule." I murmured, already running through everything I need to do. The guest room would need fresh sheets. I'd have to figure out what to cook. Did David still have that weird thing about not eating anything? Green and groceries. I definitely need to hit the grocery store. It wasn't that I disliked David. I really didn't. It was more that I didn't know him well enough to either like or dislike him. He existed in my life mainly through Mark's stories, tales from their childhood, or those vague updates Mark would share after their occasional phone calls. David was always working on some new project, usually something involving technology startups or consulting work that sounded impressive when Mark described it, but also somehow temporary and unclear. "He'll be fine," I told Mark and myself. "It'll be nice to see him." "That's my girl," Mark said, and I could hear his smile through the phone. "I should be home in about 20 minutes. Traffic's finally moving. When David arrived the following Tuesday, dragging behind him a battered old suitcase that looked like it had been through more airports than I'd probably ever see in my lifetime, it looked pretty much the same as I remembered. Tall, though not quite as tall as Mark, leaner than my husband, with a restless energy that seemed to radiate from him even when he was standing still. His eyes were always moving, always scanning, like he was taking inventory of everything around him, but never quite settling on any one thing for too long. He had the same sandy brown hair as Mark, though his was streaked with more gray at the temples. And there were lines around his eyes that spoke of late nights. Or maybe just a more intense way of living than what Mark and I were used to. He greeted me with a quick, polite hug that felt slightly awkward, the kind of embrace you give someone when you know you should hug them but aren't quite sure how to make it feel natural. He handed me a bottle of wine, something that looked expensive and had a label I didn't recognize, and then immediately turned his attention to Mark. Within seconds, we were falling into that easy, comfortable banter that brothers have revisiting. Old inside jokes that I wasn't part of, sharing memories from their childhood. Laughing about things that had happened long before I'd entered the picture. I found myself busying around the kitchen, making coffee and arranging some crackers and cheese on a plate. Feeling very much like an observer standing on the outside of their tight circle. The first evening unfolded exactly as I'd expected it would. We sat around the dinner table, Mark doing most of the talking with his usual cheerful energy, asking David about his latest business ventures and getting answers that were somehow both detailed and vague at the same time. David mostly listened, offering short responses when Mark asked him direct questions, but his gaze kept drifting toward the window, toward the darkening trees in our backyard. I tried my best to draw him into the conversation, asking about his travels, about the places he'd been living, about what it was like to move around so much. But his answers were brief, almost evasive. Not rude, exactly, just ... careful. Like he had this deeply ingrained habit of keeping his privacy, by not letting people get too close to whatever was really going on in his life. Mark, bless his heart, didn't seem to notice the way David deflected my questions. He was just happy to have his brother there, sitting at our table sharing a meal with us. It was sweet, really. How much joy Mark got from such simple things. As I started clearing the dinner plates, Mark glanced at his watch and made a face. "I've got that early conference call tomorrow with the West Coast team," he said, pushing back from the table. "I should probably go review my notes and make sure I've got all my ducks in a row." He clapped David on the shoulder, a gesture that was both affectionate and somehow protective. "Ah, you two keep chatting," he said with a grin. "Sarah can tell you all the neighborhood gossip." And then he disappeared into his study. Leaving David and me alone at the dining room table, an awkward silence settled over us like a heavy blanket. David swirled the last bit of wine around in his glass, studying it like it held some kind of secret. The old grandfather clock in our hallway started ticking louder than usual, each second stretching out and marking the quiet that had fallen between us. The house suddenly felt too still, too quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the soft whistle of wind through the trees outside. I started wiping down the counter just to have something to do with my hands. "Oakwood Creek must seem pretty sleepy," I said finally. "After, well, wherever you've been living lately." He looked up from his wineglass and for a moment saw something I hadn't expected, a faint smile that seemed genuinely surprised. Like he hadn't been expecting me to say anything at all. "It's peaceful," he said after a moment, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "Different?" For the first time since he'd arrived, his eyes met mine directly, and I saw something in them that caught me off guard. Not the restlessness I'd been expecting, but something deeper, kind of weariness, maybe, or loneliness. It was there for just a split second before it disappeared, replaced by that familiar guarded look he seemed to wear like armor. "Mark seems really happy here," he added, shifting his gaze back toward the window where he could see the outline of our trees against the dark sky. "He is," I said softly, and then found myself adding, "We have a good life here." Did I sound defensive when I said it? Maybe. I couldn't tell. David just nodded slowly, like he was thinking about something. The air between us felt thick with all the things we weren't saying, all the questions that hung in the space around us. The comfortable quiet of our home suddenly felt charged with some kind of low hum of tension that I couldn't quite name or understand. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, more like curious. I found myself genuinely wondering, maybe for the first time, about the man sitting across from me. The brother who seemed both completely connected to Mark and yet entirely separate from the life we'd built together. Who was he really? What was it like to live the way he did? Always moving, always changing. And why did he seem so tired underneath all that restless energy? The next morning, Mark left early for work, kissing me goodbye and reminding me that he'd probably be late getting home because of back-to-back meetings. I'd expected David to sleep in, or maybe disappear into the guest room with his laptop, or head out early for whatever mysterious business had brought him to town. Instead, when I padded downstairs in my robe and slippers, I found him already in the kitchen. He was standing by the window, nursing a mug of coffee and watching the birds at the feeder Mark had hung from the old oak tree. He'd already made a fresh pot of coffee, and the kitchen smelled warm and welcoming. It was such a small gesture, making coffee, but somehow it surprised me. It felt thoughtful in a way I hadn't expected from him. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup from the pot he'd made. "Morning," he replied, turning from the window. "Sleep okay?" "Like a log," I said, then laughed. "Your turn. How was the guest bed? Not too uncomfortable, I hope?" "It's dangerously comfortable, actually," he said. And this time when he smiled, it was genuine. The smile completely changed his face, softening all those lines around his eyes, and making him look more like the brother Mark always described in his stories. "Glad to hear it," I said, settling into the breakfast nook with my coffee. "Help yourself to whatever you want for breakfast. There's cereal in the pantry, yogurt in the fridge, fresh fruit on the counter. Coffee's perfect for now," he said. "Thanks." We stood there drinking our coffee in what felt like a surprisingly comfortable silence. The morning sun was streaming through the kitchen window, catching all the little dust particles floating in the air and making them dance like tiny stars. It felt much less awkward than the night before, more natural somehow. "So," he said eventually, leaning against the counter in a way that seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him yet, "what does a typical day look like for Sarah when Mark's off slaying corporate dragons?" The question surprised me. Mark usually talked about my life in these broad, affectionate strokes. My part-time job at the library, my book club meetings, my attempts at gardening. But David's question felt more direct, more genuinely curious, like he actually wanted to know. "Oh, I began, feeling a little flustered by his attention. "Tuesdays are library days, so that's where I'll be this afternoon. S'morning. Though I was planning on tackling the rose bushes before they get completely out of hand and take over the entire backyard." David's eyebrows lifted with what looked like genuine interest. "Roses. So you're a gardener." "Trying to be," I admitted, with a self-deprecating laugh. "They fight back more than you'd think. I swear sometimes they have personal vendettas against me." He chuckled, a warm, pleasant sound that I realized I hadn't heard from him before. "My landlady in Seattle had prize-winning roses," he said. "She used to talk to them, swore it helped them grow better." "Really?" I said, intrigued despite myself. "I might have to try that, though I suspect my neighbors already think I'm a bit odd for spending so much time out there muttering to myself." "Mind if I see them?" he asked. And the question was so unexpected that I almost spilled my coffee. "The roses, I'm curious." And even more unexpectedly, I found myself saying, "Not at all. Grab your coffee and come on." We wandered out into the cool morning air, and I felt a little flutter of pride as I showed him around my garden. Our backyard isn't huge, but it's become my sanctuary over the years. I pointed out the different varieties of roses I'd been experimenting with, explained my ongoing battle with black spot disease, shared the triumph I'd felt when one particularly stubborn bush had finally produced a bloom so vibrant it took my breath away. David listened attentively, asking questions that showed he was actually paying attention, not just being polite. He wanted to know about soil conditions and pruning techniques, and which varieties worked best in our climate. It was the first real conversation we'd had. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't expected to. And that's when everything started to change, though I didn't know it yet. Notice the small stone gargoyle tucked under, the Japanese maple, the wind chime side. Hung from the porch eaves, he didn't just see a garden, he seemed to see the care. I poured into it. He talked a little about the rooftop garden project he'd briefly been involved within Vancouver's challenges of urban planting. It wasn't the guarded conversation of the previous night. He was opening up just a little, sharing fragments of his own experiences. We ended up spending most of the morning out there pulling weeds, sitting beside, trimming back the deadwood onth climbers. He had a surprising knack for it, his movements deft and careful wet about books we'd read, places wet travelled. His extensive mind, less so butcherish the changing seasons it was ease. Comfortable, the subtle tension from the night before had dissolved, replaced by a gentle curiosity. I saw glimpses off man Mark knew, the thoughtful observer, the quiet intelligence, but also facets Mark perhaps didn't see or didn't mention. There was a pensiveness about him, a hint of searching that resonate with a part of me. I didn't often acknowledge when we finally came inside for lunch, leaving a pile of clippings by the compost bin. I felt a sense of connection that caught me off guard. It wasn't romantic or flirtatious, nothing like that. It was simpler, quieter, the pleasant surprise of discovering an unexpected kinship with someone I'd barely known. As we ate sandwiches at the kitchen table, the silence felt natural now, punctuated only by ticking clock and the distant hum of a lawnmower. I realized I hadn't thought about Mark or my library shift or anything else for hours. I'd just been present, enjoying the quiet company, the shared task, the unfolding conversation. David looked up from his sandwiching. This is nice," he said simply, and I knew he didn't just mean food or the garden. He meant the quiet, the connection. The unexpected ease between us, and I had to agree it was very nice indeed that evening. Mark came home buzzing about a successful meeting, full of plans for a week in Barb. He wanted to host. He launched Dinto Logistics, oblivious to the subtle shift that had occurred during the day. David retreated, slightly letting Mark take center stage, offering quiet contributions, but largely observing gain. I found myself watching David, noticing the way his gaze lingered on Mark's enthusiastic gestures, a complex mix of affection and something else, wistfulness. In his eyes. After dinner, Mark got absorbed in a phone call with Thone of our kids, discussing travel plans for the holidays. David had picked up ONAF, the books from my book club pile, a novel about navigating midlife change. Sand was leafing through it near the fireplace. I was ostensibly reading the newspaper, but my attention kept drifting. Comfortable quiet of the morning felt distant, now replaced by the familiar domestic bustle. "He never stops stows," David commented, softly glancing towards Mark, who was pacing in the way, deep in conversation. "He has a lot of energy." I agreed, folding the paper elways. "Has it's good," David said, though his tone was flat. He closed the book and placed it carefully back on the stack. "He seems settled, knows what he wants." There was an undercurrent I couldn't quit a decipher. Was it admiration, envy? Who walked over to the window, looking out into the darkness again? Much like the first night, the reflection showed his face, etched with shadows from the dim lamp beside me. "Is it enough?" he asked so quietly. I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. His back was still to me. "Is waiting now?" I asked, my voice equally low, headed his expression, open, vulnerable, in a way I hadn't seen before. The careful mask was gone. This life, the routine, the predictability, knowing what tomorrow brings. Is it fulfilling? Deep down, the question hung in the air between us, hawkingly direct. It wasn't accusatory, just raw curiosity, perhaps tinged with its own uncertainty. It touched a nerve, a question I occasionally asked myself in quiet hours, but rarely voiced. I hesitated, unsure how to answer or how make truth to offer. Mark's voice drifted in from the hall, loud and cheerful. David's gaze met mine, searching Zamatize. I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes it feels incredibly safe and comfortable. Other times, other times. I wonder about the roads. Not to Kenny hadn't meant to say it, but the words stumbled out, prompted by the unexpected dinicky of his question. The shared quit space David held my gaze. He didn't look shocked or judgmental. He simplinated a profound understanding passing between us. It felt like he saw rethrow the contented facade to the flicker of restlessness beneath the what-ifs. He murmured, "They can be loud, can't they, in?" That moment, something profound shifted. It wasn't about Mark or a marriage. Not really. It was about thy shared human experience of questioning off. Wondering, of acknowledging the path chosen and unchosen. He wasn't judging my life. He was seeing his own questions reflected in my hesitant admission. He took a step closer, not threatening, just closing the distance slightly. "You seem like someone who feels things deeply, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. "Mark, he lives more on the surface of somedies. It's not a bad thing, just different." It was an observation stated plainly, but it landed with the force of relation someone else saw. It's some understood that quiet depth I often felt when unnoticed, even by the person closest to me. It wasn't a criticism of Mark, whom David clearly loved, but an acknowledgement of me. A wave of emotion washed over me, gratitude, surprise, a strange sense of being truly seen forth, first time in a long while. Tears pricked my eyes unexpectedly. David didn't recoil or look away. He just stood there, his presence steady, affirming soul and support. He reached out, not to touch me physically, but as if offering an anchor in that sudden emotional surge. His hand hovered in the space between us for a moment before dropping back to his side. It was a shared moment of pure and adulterated emotional honesty, completely unexpected. We hadn't crossed any physical lines, but the connection felt incredibly deep, forged in sheer vulnerability and mutual respect. Mark finished his call and came back into the room, oblivious. "Everything okay?" he asked. Looking between us, David gave Asmel non-committal nod. "Just talking," said, finding my voice, managing a smile, just catching up. The intensity of the moment lingered in the air, a silent secret shared between David and me, and an expected deepening of a connection I never could have predicted. David left 2 days later. The morning of his departure was bright and crisp, autumn leva swirling across the lawn. The farewells were perfectly normal on the surface. Mark gave him a bear hug, clapping him on the back, extracting promises for more frequent visits. David smiled, thanked me graciously for my hospitality, his gaze meeting mine, briefly holding that shared understanding from the night by the fireplace. There was no awkwardness, no lingering tension, just a quiet nextment of the unexpected connection we'd formed as his rental car pulled away from the curb, disappearing in the corner. Mark sighed contentedly. "Good visit," he declared, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. Aswa stood on the porch. "Really good to see Dave." "Yes," I agreed, leaning into him. "It was." Mark went inside to get ready for work, already shifting gears back to his routine. I lingered on the porch for a few moments longer, breathing in the cool air. The visit hadn't unfolded at all as I'd expected. Nothing dramatic had happened in the conventional sense. No explosive arguments, no grand declarations, certainly none of the scandalous scenarios a clickbait title might imply, yet something profound had shifted within me. David's visit, his quiet observations, his unexpected volubility had held up a mirror to my own life. His question, "Is it enough?" echoed not as a judgment but as a validation of my own occasional unspoken queries. That moment of shared honest feeling of being truly seen and understood by someone I barely knew had been startlingly powerful. It wasn't about wanting a different life or buying gun hopey with Mark. I loved my husband, our history, the comfortable world we built, but David, the perpetual wanderer, had inadvertently reminded me of the parts of myself that existed outside that world, the contemplative side, the woman who still sometimes wondered about what ifs. It wasn't about seeking something more elsewhere, but about recognizing and valuing the depth within myself, acknowledging the quiet restlessness, not as dissatisfaction, Boots part of being alive, of being reflective. In the days that followed, I found myself moving through my routines with a renewed sense of self-awareness. Is spent more time in my garden, not just tending the roses, but truly appreciating these. Quiet solitude, the connection to theirs. I engaged more deeply in my book club discussions, less hesitant to share me own interpretations. I even started journaling. A little exploring those thoughts and feelings David's presence had stirred up. Mark noticed a subtle change. Perhaps you seem thoughtful. He commented one evening, looking up from his laptop. I smiled, just thinking he accepted that returning to his work. Our relationship hadn't changed fundamentally. The bedrock was still solid, but my perception of it and of myself within it had subtly altered. David's visit hadn't caused a rift. Instead, it had unexpectedly provided a moment of clarity, a chance for personal reflection and growth. It was a reminder thought connection can come in surprising forms, and that being truly seen, even briefly, by someone on a different path can illuminate your own invaluable ways. It wasn't the dramatic tale the title might suggest, but a quiet internal unfolding. A deeply emotional experience rooted in mutual respect and the surprising discovery of shared humanity. Sometimes those are the stories that stay with you the longest.